Hello and welcome to Poche Conversations. I am Sarosh Anklasaria, and it is a real honor for me to introduce our speaker for today, Anthony Acciavati. Just to give you a brief background, we've had S. Vishwanath, who is a practitioner from Bangalore who talks of groundwater and surface water. And we've had Dilip Dakunha recently, who spoke about the notion of wetness. And in that sense, Anthony's talk pivots really well with our ongoing explorations on water. Anthony is a historian, cartographer, and architect, and the Daniel Rose Professor of Architecture at Yale University. He has taught at Princeton and Columbia University, as well as the Rhode Island School of Design. His talk today, Ganga, a Monsoonal Machine, is based on his recent book, Ganges Water Machine 2015, which is the first comprehensive mapping and urban history of the Ganges River Basin in over half a century. He spent a decade hiking, driving, and boating across the Ganga in order to map it and to understand the historical conflicts over water for drinking, agriculture, and industry. Combining fieldwork with archival research, the book is an atlas of the enterprise to transform the Ganges into the most hyper-engineered landscape in the world. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to get a hold of the book, please do so. It is an absolute joy just as a piece to behold. In 2016, Ganges Water Machine was awarded the 2016 John Brinkerhoff Jackson Book Prize. Along with the book, Ganges Water Machine is an internationally traveling exhibition with recent shows in New York, Mumbai, and New Delhi. Recent publications include chapters on the work of Charles and Ray Eames in India, the history of infrastructure and urban growth in Asia, temporary cities and agriculture in monsoonal landscapes, and the formation of new scientific disciplines like psychorheology. Anthony is currently completing a book on the history of science and design in Asia and Americas. His work has been supported by extensive grants and fellowships from all over the world. He is a founding editor of Manifest, a journal of American architecture and urbanism, and he has written extensively the New York Times, Cabinet, Indian Express, Architectural Design, and Topos, among other places. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Acciavati.
Thank you, Sarosh, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for the invitation to be here with you here today. I was quite taken by the work that's being undertaken at Poche, and so it was a pleasure and an honor to be asked to share my work with all of you on Ganga. And as I understand it, there's quite a bit of work that's going on with all of you along the Yamuna or Jamuna, depending upon where you're at along the river. So today, what I'd like to do is really do a presentation of this body of work that, as Sarosh had mentioned, is the outcome of a decade, in some ways more than a decade, because the work kind of never ends on Ganga. And what I'll be talking with you about today is really work from my book, Ganges Water Machine, Designing New India's Ancient River. It's a 400+ page book. As a dear friend of mine likes to say, it really reads like a 350-page book. I'm not going to try to squash the book and its contents into this presentation in full. So that means that I won't really go over how the book is constructed beyond saying that it's 4 parts. First part really looks at the cultural landscape of the Ganga Basin, trying to really understand the layers of sacred geography all the way to the kind of political, biophysical conditions of the river basin. Second part of the book looks at the transformation of the river basin into a giant water machine. I'll speak a little bit about that in terms of centralized infrastructure versus decentralized. So canals versus tube wells, or surface water versus groundwater. The third part looks at that then decentralization with tube well infrastructure in the 20th century. And then the fourth part is a dynamic atlas that really focuses on the area between Allahabad and Varanasi, or as it's known today, Prayagraj and Varanasi. So this work has not just then been a book, as was mentioned, but I would say if I had to explain, well, why write a book to visualize the Ganga basin in terms of those layers that I mentioned to you? The very simple answer is that essentially words and numbers fail to capture the dynamism and deep rhythms of this monsoonal landscape. And so what I'm going to share with you today is my attempts at trying to visualize this landscape, not only chronologically, meaning how has it developed kind of, let's say, from 1800 to 1850 to the present, but also imaging this landscape cyclically. So how do the monsoons transform this landscape every year? And certainly I also try to find other methods and mediums that were mentioned that I'll speak about more towards the end in terms of writing op-eds for the New York Times and the Indian Express on the unique forms of urbanism and architecture that have been taking shape here for quite some time. And certainly also the exhibitions that I do as well around this work. So methods and mediums are very important to the work that I do and what I'm going to share with you today. Now, if I had to say, what is this project primarily focusing on? It's three rather large things and how they come together. So monsoons, so of course that in the plural, population density, and agriculture. Now, what I don't have then time for you to do today, in terms of what I have time to do to share with you, is say, for example, what I write about in the book, how this figure, James Rennell, that you see here to the right, had a paper read at the Royal Society in London in 1781, where he had been beginning to map the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. He spoke quite actually eloquently about the way in which the monsoons are wafted as vapors from the Bay of Bengal and radically transform the landscape every year. Yet when he had to make a map, a kind of cartographic map, it's a map that looks like this. It's a map where rivers are treated as two parallel lines, cities are but dots that are connected by roadways. And so it works very well as a map in terms of how to march an army and how to collect taxes for the East India Company. But there's a flattening that happens in terms of his description. And the reason for that is because imperialism and colonialism really require a flattening of space and not a thickening of it. And so the work that I do looks at, well, how do we start to thicken this, not just description verbally, but also visually as well. And so this legacy is something that inhabits so many of the drawings and maps that we find the world over, this legacy of colonialism and imperialism when it comes to representing dynamic landscapes the world over. That also means that, for example, I'm not going to talk to you about how, say, Jules Verne wrote a book called The Demon of Kampur, and in 1880 about a group of British and French engineers that traveled across the Gangetic Plains in a steam-powered elephant. And Verne writes very beautifully about, for example, an electric charge that starts to overtake the landscape in the days leading up to the monsoons. Yet when he has to actually make a map, again, it's a map like you see to the right. Rivers are treated just as lines, cities as points, and not much else is there. So again, there's this legacy of flattening space that we see well into the 19th and 20th century and to this day, or even I would say in these yatra maps, right? These pilgrimage maps that I would collect all throughout my work. Here you can see all of these mandirs or temples, right? That are all throughout the kind of upper reaches of the Himalayas, but in no way do you see, for example, Tari Dam or all of the other dams that have been put in place to produce electricity, reroute water, It's understood primarily as this sacred geography in an almost pristine condition, but doesn't show the amount of infrastructure that's been put in place to transform it. So my job was really, how do you bring all of these histories, legacies of drawing and layer them together to develop a much thicker mode of visualizing this landscape? And most of the work that I did, and what's nice about sharing this work primarily with people in South Asia as opposed to Firangis or Goras, is that I don't have to tell you that UP, as you all very well know, would be the 6th most populous country in the world. It produces close to 20% of India's food grains. And I think by this year, actually, estimates are that it will have 270 million people living in it. Same size as Great Britain, or half the size of the state of California. So that level of density is quite unprecedented, yet the government still statistically sees most of this area as 60% rural. Happy to talk more about why urban and rural in a context like UP is extremely problematic, in the same way about trying to define where a river ends and begins, much like a city, is as I think of as a rather impossible task. UP, of course, is also where not only the Yamuna, but Ganga kind of pass through. And as you can see in this map of irrigation works, it's an incredible amount of irrigation infrastructure, just in terms of canals, nalas, and nadis, or rivers, that one finds in this area. This was perhaps one of the best maps that I could find before UP was bifurcated some years ago. And just again, you can see the level of hydrological activity that exists here is quite immense. And I usually show this set of drawings that that IIHS, Indian Institute of Human Settlements, created in 2011, last census. This is the first spatialization, really, of the census data at the level of very large villages all the way down to hamlets or smaller. And as we can see, UP, Bihar is really a hotspot for a level of density that even within India is relatively unprecedented. So looking at then how this density of population, monsoons, and agriculture are also entangled with one another was one of the many tasks that I had before me. Now, when I say that this is a hyper-engineered landscape, let me begin with some comparisons that I do in the book. So let's take the Amazon River Basin, said to be the largest in the world, and let's do a kind of exploded axonometric of the basin. So here you can see the footprint, not just the rivers as lines, but really the footprint of the watershed. And let's say we look at it in terms of rain-fed agriculture, like you see here, versus irrigated agriculture. There's very little irrigated agriculture really within the basin. And in fact, as you can see, most of the agriculture outside and even inside is primarily rain-fed. Now, say I do that and I look at the Yellow River Basin in the People's Republic of China, we can see here that there's quite a bit of rain-fed agriculture in this exploded axonometric, but an incredible amount of irrigated, mostly outside of the basin, that exists, but quite a lot we can see in this image of the Yellow River Basin in China. But it's when we come to the Ganga that it's really unprecedented. And here you can see just the hydrological supersurface that really connects, for all practical purposes, with the Indus. And there is no other part of the planet that has this level of irrigation in terms of canals, in terms of tube wells, in terms of hand pumps, nalas, tanks, etc. So this level of infrastructural excess is really quite unique to the basin. And it's something that, again, I'll talk more about in terms of part-to-whole relationships to urbanization and agriculture more generally, and the conflicts that arise. But again, I want to just pause here for a moment to just take in this level of excess of infrastructure. Now, the term Ganges water machine is not my own. As I write in the book, it's actually a term that was developed by a civil engineer, Professor V. Lakshminarayana, who taught at IIT Kanpur, and a demographer named Roger Rivet, who taught at Harvard University. And they wrote in the 1975 special issue of Science this article called The Ganges Water Machine, where essentially they said that the Ganges is this great hydrological machine, especially in terms of its groundwater to surface water that's recharged every year with the monsoons, but it's, as they put it, underutilized. Now, they only call the river basin a machine in the title, and then nowhere else in the article do they do this. Instead, they primarily just focus on developing equations of how to utilize this machine more. My job then was, well, how do we start to visualize all of the moving parts of this machinery, of this very large organic machine, which is the river basin? Now, it's not a machine like a kind of chronometer, like a mechanical device, but instead it's something that probably is more akin to, say, the self-destructive art of the 1960s, where actually the machine is oftentimes at odds with itself. So there's a kind of destructibility within it, where there's competition, certainly between tube well infrastructure, canal irrigation, etc. And so trying to understand then the parts and pieces of this machine and how they work together, but also how they're oftentimes in conflict. And it's, again, not just a mechanical machine, but it's actually probably something closer to a kind of cyborg, a little bit like Luke Skywalker's bionic arm in The Empire Strikes Back, where you can see that it's organic material, his hand, but then we also can see the mechanical features of human engineered mechanical tendons, etc., that course through his bionic arm. So understanding the river basin as this organic machine, or a biology that has a technology, or a technology that has a biology. And the two principal components of that biological machine, which are the irrigation system of canals versus the tube wells. Canals primarily get developed here in terms of the Ganga during the 19th century. They have a much longer history, as all of you know, along the Yamuna River that I'm happy to talk more about. But essentially, canals, highly centralized systems. They're like roads or highways in terms of irrigating and redirecting water, versus the tube well, which is kind of like the exact opposite. If the canals are these monumental infrastructures that are like an interstate or highway system, the tube well are like these little holes, usually not more than, 20, 30 centimeters, depending upon the size in terms of diameter, that are drilled into the ground to draw up water. They're very decentralized, completely unregulated within a context like India. That's starting to change with the green tribunals, but they're really the inverse of this highly centralized canal system. And I'll talk about how then governance and tragedy of the commons starts to intersect with competition between these two infrastructures. Now in the book, I look at, well, how did this become a kind of laboratory of the 19th and 20th centuries for developing centralized and decentralized water infrastructure? Kind of pocket history is essentially East India Company in the 19th century. They keep moving up the Gangetic Plains, taking over more and more of the remnants of the Mughal Empire until, of course, 1857 with the first rebellion. But what the East India Company starts to notice in this time is as they keep moving further and further up the Gangetic Plains, famines are occurring. And rather than think that this might have something to do with changes in taxation, colonialism, and imperialism, they're convinced that this is because agriculture is dependent upon the monsoons. So the idea was create a new form of centralized water distribution, a canal, or create a new river or an artificial river from an existing one like the Ganga. And so Sir Proby Cautley develops the system that you see a bit here that looks very much like a kind of highway for water in the 19th century. And the British have absolutely no background in irrigation canals. They have them with navigation, but nothing when it came to irrigation. They looked to Italy as an example to try to follow, as well as, of course, the Mughals, but still nothing at the scale of what they end up doing with the Ganges Canal that opens in 1854. They have to build the longest aqueduct in the world, longer than anything that the Romans built, in order to take the waters of the Ganga that they capture at Haridwar and to bring it to the Gangetic plains. They have to deal with a lot of rows or torrents, and as well as rivers. So there's incredible changes in topography that probably many of you are very familiar with that happen in those foothills leading up to the Himalayas. Now, when it opens in 1854, the canal is the longest canal system in the world. It's 5 times the length of all of the canals in Lombardy, Italy, and Egypt combined. And it starts at Haridwar and courses through the Ganga Jamuna Doab, or interfluve, or land between 2 rivers, and terminates originally at Kanpur. Today, of course, it extends all the way to Allahabad. And so I draw in the book the evolution of this supersurface, which today the canal system with the upper and lower Ganga canal is over 12,000 kilometers long. So it's the longest canal system in the world. And I've spent a great deal of time walking and driving across the canals as well as the riverbed itself. So this is a drawing showing how it's developed over time as a testing bed for this new form of centralized infrastructure. You can see here what are called super passages. They're essentially flyovers for the river. So here the canal is literally passing beneath the river, so that all of that silt, or like you see here, all of that silt doesn't get into the canal, because the silt really starts to tear apart at the canal system itself. So you have to build all of these flyovers for river and canal to pass one another so they don't intersect. And because of all of the debris and detritus, like think boulders, tree trunks, etc., coming down from the Himalayas during the monsoon, all of this infrastructure has to be rebuilt, like you see here with these bumpers, concrete, to slow down the velocity of all of that detritus. And the monsoons, and I would say, are the great architects of this landscape. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about the monsoons, other than to say that a kind of pocket explanation of them is this fire-water cocktail that all of you are so used to experiencing every year, of the difference in temperature between the subcontinent and the Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, produces this tempestuous rains every year. I look and draw, kind of cut sections through the monsoons, like you see here. I won't go into great detail about it, but these tempestuous rains that happen every year transform the landscape, and have been doing so for close to 50 million years, we estimate. Now, for me, the geometry and geography of the monsoons really come together then with the landmass beginning 50 million years ago, when the subcontinent runs into Asia and starts to crink and crimple up to produce the Himalayas. So over 50 million years, these start to develop, world's tallest mountain range. And I think you can see in these sections that I've cut through the subcontinent and the Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, just that incredibly uneven bowl that has developed between the Himalayas and then the Bundelkhand Massif and then the Vindhya Hills further south. That uneven bowl is not just a space where all of that torrential rain comes down every year, but as I'll show you in a moment, the amount of silt that comes down. And what I do is, in those sections, I don't just draw then solid versus void, kind of land mass versus space, but I also then start to draw out the rainfall patterns in section as opposed to plan, so that I can better understand the relationship between rainfall patterns to geometry and geography on the ground. And I do that over the course of a single year of the Earth orbiting the sun. So I use winter season, pre-monsoon, monsoon, and post-monsoon to really start to map out the choreography of rainfall, and use the equinoxes and the solstice as though it's a giant kind of water clock to better understand and visualize the temporalities of the monsoons. And as I was saying, the amount of silt that is shed from the Himalayas every year is unprecedented. 1.6 billion tons of silt are shed every year. To give you some sense of this, the amount that we're dealing with here, the Mississippi River Basin, said to be the second largest river basin in the world, has a third of what the Ganga has. Ganga barely makes it into the top 30 in terms of river basins, in terms of its scale. But the amount of silt that comes down every year is just unprecedented. And this is just in Ganga, this isn't also in Brahmaputra. So these photographs, I think, give a sense of then just the amount of silt and velocity of rainfall that happens. These are a series of photos I took in 2005 in October in Benares. And you can see here, there's not really a cloud in the sky. It's humid in October. There's no rainfall, yet you can see that just over these 2 days, the level of water along the Ghats is going up and down. Now you'd think that this was tidal, but we're over 600 kilometers from the coast. So obviously it's not tidal, but it's not just that the river is going up and down in the riverbed, but the amount of silt that gets deposited here every day as well is immense. So trying to understand that choreography of silt as well as water and people is an incredibly important part of the work that I do. And I would say following the soil is almost more important than following the water, because the soil gets transported through different conditions of water or waters, thinking of it in the plural. Now, my job then was to really try to see like an anablep. And what I mean by that is an anablep is called a four-eyed fish. And the reason I show you this is because, as you all know, when we as human beings go underwater, you know how the water, the light starts to get refracted and things look wavy? Well, the anablep is able to engage or live in this realm where those two worlds meet, because they have eyes like human beings to see above the water, and they have eyes like fish to see perfectly like a fish does underwater. So I was trying to inhabit the space of seeing like an anablep, or this four-eyed fish, in terms of being both within the water but also above it. And that allows me to see not only then just rainfall patterns and seeing not just a river as two parallel lines, but really as a watershed, but also understanding how all of that silt that's been shed for 50 million years creates this incredibly lush landscape that we know as the Gangetic Plains, where the ground acts like a sponge. And that sponge holds water so well that it's what gives it the greatest groundwater potential in all of India. And what that means is that it's a prime spot to develop groundwater infrastructure like tube wells. So not only do we have the longest canal system in the world, with the Ganges canal system, but also because of all of those millions of years of silt being shed, we have ground that's like a sponge that makes it an ideal place to sink tube wells, because in many places you don't have to go more than a meter or 2 meters to get groundwater. Certainly in Western UP, Punjab, you have to go deeper, but in Eastern UP and certainly in Bihar and West Bengal, definitely not as deep. So I look at then how that geography of soil made this a testing bed for tube well infrastructure. India today is the largest consumer of groundwater in the world. I counted several 100,000 tube wells in my work, but there's estimates that anywhere between 8 to 20 million tube wells exist in the Gangetic Plains alone. It's a completely unregulated economy, so we don't know how many they are or where they're all located. But one of the things I look at in the book is, for example, in the 1960s, one would find films division films like this of these lorries coming to a Punjabi village where you can see the ox-driven carts to sink a tube well, and then you see all of this water gushing out on demand. It's a kind of wet dream of development, with the idea that if the canals were highly centralized, legacy of colonialism, the tube well is decentralized water on demand. Farmers can be in control more of how they flood and irrigate their crops. But when you have millions and millions of tube wells, water table levels start to drop, and not everybody has access to them. So I look at how, for example, this was such an important technology for the Green Revolution, where here we see the Punjabi farmer with the high yield variety wheat over his right shoulder. And then we see the tube well here in the foreground, DDT being sprayed to kill pests. And then we see the tractor in the background for this Punjab National Bank advertisements from '75. Yet today, most tube wells one encounters in the Gangetic Plains, we don't actually really see them so much. We find advertisements like this one from Crompton Greaves, where it really draws the tube well in section, as opposed to thinking about it in plan. And I would say that the tube well has really introduced a different way of thinking about water extraction and delivery, much more in section as opposed to plan. And this is very much tied to then the monsoons, because the monsoons recharge groundwater every year. And I'll show you why that starts to wreak havoc in terms of urbanization, because the monsoons are not able to get into the groundwater in ways that they used to be able to raise groundwater levels. One often finds tube wells, in buildings such as this, and I won't go into great depth about them, no pun intended, as many of you know about tube wells, but for me, they are such an important technological intervention within the river basin, and the politics and social dimensions of them are extremely important within the basin. And of course, also all of the hand pumps that one finds throughout the basin in places as diverse as Kanpur and Patna, but also all throughout so many small towns and hamlets throughout the basin. And certainly also large-scale pumping technologies like this Naranpour pumping station, said to be the largest in all of in all of Asia. This fellow here, just to give you a sense, is about 1.5 meters tall. And you can see just the discoloration of the edge of this pumping station because of how much Ganga goes up and down. This is outside of Mirzapur, just a little bit to the south of Banaras. I write about in the book about a group of women who hold me up with machine guns when I was starting to map out this area. But these pumping stations are being paired and have been paired with canal irrigation as well. So it's not that they're completely separate from one another. They're really layered with one another within this landscape. But it's this combination of surface water bodies like kund, thals, as well as tube wells, canals that create this unique patterns of urbanization that exist all across the Gangetic Plains. And it's not so much it's not a story of technological succession. It's not that tube wells replaced canals. It's that they all started to get overlapped with one another. And so it's why you have then in a place like UP, high density urban agglomerations like in Banaras and Allahabad, but you also have these kinds of mound cities north of Mirzapur, or certainly smaller kind of hamlets where it's a kind of agropolis or spreads in densities of agriculture and urban growth throughout the area. And one of the things that I do in this work is I don't present, and you've probably noticed I have not once mentioned pollution. Now, I'll say a little bit about that. Typical BBC, Ganges, India's dying mother, right? And we see this flyover and we see this Nala here, right? We see the BBC correspondent choking because of the smell that's coming from this Nala, right? Talking about the level of pollution. India's Ganges is said to be one of the top 10 most polluted rivers in the world. And we oftentimes then will encounter different do-it-yourself, right, kind of jugaad methods of dealing with water purification or filtration. Like you can find endless numbers of YouTube videos on how to do this. Tata's gotten into the game with the Tata Swatch to clean water. We all know certainly all of the AquaGuard systems. Development experts love this lifesaver of somebody being able to stick a straw into water and sucking it out, and it's clean on the other end. This is the kind of technological fix that if we just create the right technology, we can fix this, all the way to kind of irrigation systems and sprinklers like you see here, certainly AquaGuard systems to try to take out alkalis and other toxins within water, to I don't know why it is, Italians seem to do a lot of these kind of terracotta water filters, right, that are produced through condensation, where we see the clean water or drinkable water that comes out at the end. They show the sectional diagram of the condensation produced. We see the Indian woman who can carry her child on her hip and then the water on her head to be able to walk a great distance if need be. But for me, all of these technologies, they produce this. This is a urinal that stands near the Sangam in Allahabad. And for me, this is really a telling image because this urinal is in no way connected to a larger infrastructure. And so this idea that this technology, yes, it may change behavior patterns, but if it's not part of a larger system, much like the way that the tube wells, bottom-up technologies that are in no way kind of regulated or choreographed, they produce, I think, an effect that's very much like this, where there's a real tragedy of the commons. And so the work that I do doesn't go, it really looks at where does this kind of bottom up and the top down meet in this kind of middle range. So if an airplane flies, you know, kind of 30,000 feet above the surface of the earth, many people, are closer to the ground. I try to engage or move like a sinusoidal wave between these two worlds in the drawings and the maps that I'll share with you today, to not try to repeat what I think is this kind of technological fix of the urinal that's just standing out in the middle of the open. Now, that's already a lot to deal with, but there's also, of course, all of the celestial and terrestrial dimensions of the river basin. And so for me, the tale of Ganga's descent, as I write about in the book, and again, I'm not going to go into great detail about this with all of you, because many of you probably know it quite well. But for me, Ganga's descent is extremely telling because, as you all know, Ganga is willing to kind of come down to earth, but to wash away all of these kind of smoldering pyres of dead relatives of a great king. However, her weight is so great that she'll break the earth. So one of the stories or explanations, other than the one of Vishnu, right, kind of with his foot, is actually Shiv catching her in the locks of his hair to break her fall. And what I love about this is that it actually is a very sophisticated way to think about a watershed. If we think about it, not again as two parallel lines as a river, but instead as literally Shiv's wet mop of hair as the basin, that we understand it, the river and hair kind of being entangled with one another. It's a very useful, I think, way of conceptualizing the river basin. Now, of course, there's a set of politics that I'm happy to discuss with it, that have certainly been taken up. But I think at its most fundamental level, it's a very useful way into thinking alternatively about the river basin. And I think also helps us rethink then the typical terrestrial sites that are imbued with celestial significance, like you see in all of these yatra maps that in no way then show the dynamism of the landscape and the infrastructure that's put into place. So I preface all of that with then saying, okay, I began this work in 2004. I write a Fulbright proposal to say, give me a year to come to India. Fulbright is a joint project between the United States government and foreign governments that allow American citizens to go abroad, Indian citizens or other foreign nationals to come to the United States to study. I write this Fulbright proposal in 2004. The best books I can find are, say, photo essays by Raghubir Singh, on the Ganga, madcap adventures like Eric Newby's Slowly Down the Ganges, where by the end of the book, his wife divorces him because of the tumultuous boat ride that they undertake, to Histories of Cartography by Matthew Edney, or this avalanche of statistics of this irrigation projects in India. But in no way could I find how do people choreograph their lives and space in this monsoonal landscape, agriculturally productive, and so densely populated. Google Earth, extremely low resolution. It's just going live in 2004 in terms of being accessible. So I can't really use Google Earth to do this work. Drones exist, but not in the way that they've been taken up in the world today. They're mostly being used for nefarious ends by George Bush's administration to assassinate people around the world. So I don't have access to drones. The GRACE satellite system, which was developed to monitor not only gravitational pull of the Earth, but also a useful tool for groundwater, the level of resolution that it can provide is so low that it, again, would be useless for the work that I wanted to do. So I wrote a Fulbright proposal to say, give me a year, I'll go to India with this Garmin eTrex GPS unit that you see here and a camera to develop a dynamic atlas of the river basin. And I was hoping that when I got to India, I might find maps, but it turned out the best maps I could find were from the 1960s and 70s. Usually these were just tracings of maps from before. The Survey of India hadn't really comprehensively mapped the basin and much of the country in about half a century, if not more. So when I got to India, I was hoping I could find maps, but I couldn't find any, and oftentimes I would be asked if I worked for the CIA. So not only were there no maps, but there was a certain level of suspicion about what was the work that I was doing. Of course, I don't work, nor never did, for the CIA, but this was some of the kind of dialogue that I would encounter in order to do the work that I was trying to undertake. So I literally had to be a barefoot architect, hydrographer, cartographer, historian to do this work. And I show you these images not to show you how bad I look with long hair, I know it's terrible, but instead that I really had to go out and walk the land and traverse it in order to develop the drawings that I'll share with you today. And so I went all the way from Gotri Glacier, 3,800 meters above sea level, through the Gangetic Plains, taking over 25,000 photographs, not just of the river edge, but coursing all throughout the watershed to better understand the choreography of people, soil, and water. And I had to end the book in Banaras, Varanasi, just because the book was supposed to be 200 pages. It ended up being 400 pages. My publisher was ready to kill me. So, because I had another 150 pages that I had to take out. But the book ends at the city of Banaras. And a lot of the work that I did and that I'll share with you with the drawings took place in Allahabad or Prague, which, as all of you know, is where Ganga, Yamuna, and then for some, another third water body, the Saraswati, converge. This satellite image is very telling because you can see the braiding of the Ganga to the north, that incredibly unusual about turn, or right turn rather, to meet the Yamuna. And you can see that the Yamuna doesn't move that much, whereas Ganga moves a lot. Well, the reason for that is that even though both of these rivers are fed from the Himalayas, the amount of silt that comes into the Ganga as opposed to the Yamuna is such that it's a very shallow river, the Ganga versus the Yamuna. And for that reason, it's why it moves so much, because of all of that silt that's imbricated in all of the water that's being shed and then gets moved around with the monsoons. So this is not just the meeting of two watersheds, but also the meeting of two geological provinces in terms of where these rivers meet. The best drawings I could find of these cities were actually this calendar art that you find all throughout that tells you a lot about the sacred geographies for so many Hindus of these areas. But what I love about these drawings is the way in which the celestial and the terrestrial come together. So here we have Ganga, Saraswati, Jamuna, but we also have a rail line, a South India temple. We have a mosque, Akbar Kila, the fort built by Akbar, a church, housing, etc., all coming together, layered in these drawings that I think is extremely useful for how we understand the social, political, and biophysical layers of the basin. And where those two rivers meet, you can literally see the blue waters of the Yamuna and the brown-gray waters of the Ganga. And this is a kind of microcosm for me of all throughout the basin, because this line, this most sacred site within Hinduism, is always in flux. It's always moving. So rather than trying to draw this area statically, how do we draw it dynamically to incorporate the dynamism of this area? And so I developed a series of techniques that combine cartography and photography together that I'll tell you about with Allahabad to start to map out these celestial, terrestrial, cyclical time variations that happen throughout the basin. So the drawing that you see to the left is how the Ganga and all of the surface water bodies and the Yamuna rivers expand and contract with the monsoons. And then the photographs to the right are taken panoramas over the course of a year at the Sangam. Now those tones of violet correspond to times of the solstice and equinoxes. So I take the ellipse of the Earth going about the sun and make it a straight line. Those tones of violet that you see here, they make their way into here. So this is the surface water bodies in April, May, June, August, September. Then I draw all of the nalas, rivers, the settlement patterns that exist here, all of the roadways, to bring all of these layers together to develop what I would say is a much thicker drawing of this area. Now, this drawing, if you think about it in fashion terms, it's less like couture, or think wedding season, where, you know, during wedding season, you get your suit or your sari made, and it's really meant to be worn once and to fit you at a very particular moment in time. So couture like that versus, say, ready to wear, like what you can get at Mango, H&M, where you lose a few kilos, gain a few kilos, it still fits because there's what's called in apparel an inseam allowance. So the drawings that I make allow for us to see how this area expands and contracts every year, to not fix settlement and rivers so much as to understand how they're choreographed with one another. And then I would go to the Sangam, photograph it. You know, Magh Mela happens, right, where 2 to 3 million people come to the river every year. This great festival, the electricity lines that are placed, the roadways, draw all of it. And I'm going to go very quickly through it because I don't have to explain what a plan is versus a section, which is so nice to share this work with all of you, as opposed to when I'm speaking in front of policy people. But I draw all of the settlement, the people, roadways, cultivated lands in a summation. So I draw this temporary tent city. But what's incredible is that when this festival ends in January, February, the roadways still are imprinted on the banks of the river and on the shoals, and farmers move in and they use it for agriculture. So they use this incredibly densely populated area for agriculture. They harvest their crops, the monsoons come, and it washes all of it away. And this happens, of course, every year. But it's this incredibly intelligent use of space, because we go from hyper-urban to agricultural to then completely washed away every year. And these are the first set of drawings that draw this change over time and narrate it as well, with the idea that if you draw this, how can we build upon this intelligent use of space rather than trying to thwart it or minimize it or ignore it? So I think this kind of dynamism, these rhythms of the monsoon, are something we can build upon, not just within South Asia, but in many parts of the world, especially as areas face climate disruption and change. These tactics of developing and building on that dynamism is extremely important and useful. But to my surprise, these sets of drawings have made it into the UN's Quito papers as a way of drawing the biophysical and cultural and sacred geographies of cities, not as fixed spaces, but really as dynamic spaces, and how do you use different mediums and methods for this. And certainly we all know then the Kumbh that happens, right, every 12 to 13 years, the pontoon bridges that are built across this area where 80 to 100 million people pass through. These are photos that I took of it in 2013. The incredible temporary city that's built for these 5 to 6 million inhabitants that stay there for those 45 days. Inhabited 24 hours a day. But for me, what's more amazing than all of this, which is a feat unto itself, is that in 2 weeks, it goes from this to this. The city is pulled up, farmers move in, the water table level is so naturally high that you don't have to dig more than 20 centimeters to hit groundwater to irrigate crops. Farmers use the roads and avenues for that temporary city for agricultural plots. The imprint of the tents and the roads remain in the sandbars, so it's like a drawing at the scale of the territory. It's tattooed into the landscape. And then, of course, all of this gets washed away every year. And it's not just then that it's a space for agriculture and for religious gatherings, but it's certainly also a space of recreation. It's an incredible mixed use space. My colleagues in public health are always they wince a little bit at this, and certainly in a pandemic period, this kind of proximity of people is extremely rare. But again, I think the water buffalo wallas that are here, along with the navvalas, the pujas that are taking place, and of course all of the people bathing in the bazaar. It's an incredibly rich use of space that I think again is something to be built upon rather than trying to do away with. And all of that silt and sand is also being harvested as well for concrete mixture throughout the basin as well, oftentimes illegally, like you see here. But I try to understand all of that dynamism at Allahabad within the larger basin itself. And so I use the transect, a kind of swath of land that goes from ridgeline to shoreline to image this area. And I won't go through an exhaustive history of it, other than to say that it's a technique developed by Alexander von Humboldt in the late 18th century when he goes to South America. And it's a useful way of thinking about space in section as opposed to just in plan. And so von Humboldt goes to South America. This is a transect where you can see what today we would call almost the ecologies and elevation going up all the way to the top of the Andes, but also these thick descriptions of what he experiences along with the instruments that he uses to give a much thicker description visually as well as textually of this landscape. Becomes very useful and important in the 19th century, where people start to use this technique to compare, say, the Himalayas with the Andes. So looking at different kinds of environments, not just non-human, but human as well in elevation in terms of terrace farming, forests, volcanoes, snow caps, geology, and also ways in which the animal kingdom and the mineral kingdom and the vegetal kingdom start to come together to understand that relationship of not these biology and geology being so separate, but how they're really related to one another. And ultimately, Patrick Geddes with his valley section, where he goes from ridgeline to shoreline to show how humans co-author space, to understand different habits and economies in relationship to the environments, not only that they're extracting, but also co-authoring. So I try to not understand nature and culture as being in a state of conflict, but really how they're making and unmaking one another throughout the basin. And Geddes did a lot of work in India that went into eventually his valley section, and Ian McCarg using it in design with nature as a design tool, as opposed to just purely an analytical tool. So I take that idea of the transect and I cut transects north-south, really perpendicular to the riverbed of the Ganga, so that I can really start to image those layers that I showed you in Allahabad in these 6 transects that you see here. So I image the surface water bodies, so you can see just how dynamic the Ganga is and these larger rivers that are within it, but also all of the roadways, all of the settlement. And by the way, I did all of this by foot and boat and by hand. I didn't have satellite imagery. I didn't have maps. So it took a very long time to develop these drawings. All of the surface water in terms of the tanks and ponds, all of the canals and nullas, to then bring all of those layers together to again image this territory in terms of its dynamism. And go into greater depth in terms of looking at cropping patterns with the transect, so that I can understand surface water and groundwater in relationship to tube wells and hand pumps, as well as cropping patterns throughout the 2 primary seasons throughout the basin. All with an idea of how do we then maybe start to develop soft infrastructures, because so much of the pollution that enters the Ganga River basin primarily comes through nalas. And how do we develop soft infrastructures like bioswales and wetlands that don't require electricity, like sewage treatment plants, to better deal with all of the runoff that comes from urbanization within the area. So these drawings that I've developed not only locate where all of these nullas are, but also start to show how they expand and contract with the monsoons and agriculture and urbanization. The last part of the talk then focuses, and I promise we're very close, to the end are the instruments and prosthetics, because I had to make instruments to map this area because I didn't have contemporary maps or satellite imagery. So this is a surface accumulation sleeve that I designed. It's a prosthetic that you literally wear over your right arm. Like you can see here, you can see the Garmin eTrex GPS unit along with a space for my Nokia mobile phone. This is 2005, and space for packaging tape. And so I use the packaging tape and triangulate with satellites on GPS to not only locate where I'm at on the surface of the Earth, but also to collect soil samples. And so the packaging tape works a little bit like, you know, the web that Spider-Man shoots from his wrist. Well, the packaging tape comes off of my arm, and I go a kilometer perpendicular to the river edge to collect soil samples, and it leaves an imprint like you see here. And what that allows me to do is I can collect the particle sizes of the soil, and that can tell me a lot about the behavior of a river, because the size of the distribution of soils where they're dispersed tells you about how the river expands and contracts all throughout an area. And the technique is very much like this Nintendo game developed in 2003 called Katamari Damacy, which is about this little creature that you see here that's trying to create new galaxies and worlds, where he has this object that begins by collecting things like spoons, paper clips, scissors, darts. But as he rolls it across areas, it starts to collect jungle gyms and ultimately entire cities to create these new cosmos. And the thing is that my instruments, they don't just pick up soils, they pick up car parts, human fecal matter, they pick up marigolds, they pick up plastic bottles. So I'm able to do a kind of ethnography of the soil, not just in terms of particle sizes, but also understanding the river basin as a giant sorting machine to better understand how humans and non-humans inhabit this area. And I've made further iterations of the surface accumulation sleeve like you see here, and as well as an instrument so that I can literally analyze different rolls of tape, because the tape gets, you know, very, very large once all of that soil is collected. And I'm able to then put it on a machine like I've drawn here to analyze the different soil conditions, and not just soils, but also forms of inhabitation. I scanned all of these hundreds of rolls of tape, so hundreds of kilometers of tape with soil, to then start to understand better the particle sizes. Now, I didn't have access to any fancy machinery, so what I did was I used the Magic Wand tool in Photoshop. Now, the Magic Wand tool might be used for something like this, when you want to place a tattoo on someone's chest, right? Where you cut out all of that white space to place it on this chest. But instead, I misused the Magic Wand tool to be able to break up the soil sizes. And it allows me to do a kind of do-it-yourself remote sensing, misusing this technology. So I'm using the wrong thing for the right reason. And I do all of this so that I can collect soils and image this area. It's not just that I used Photoshop and packaging tape, but also I developed another technology that I call the Ganga dip sock, where I bought 100 pairs of pristine white tube socks and would thrust them into the river basin to collect soils, with the idea that I would also use this as a way to start to image and index this landscape. And I use all of these very sophisticated technologies, as you can see, to make these kinds of drawings. It's what allows me to do these kinds of ready-to-wear drawings, because I obviously can't be in all these places at the same time, but the soil can tell me a great deal about this area. So I'm a kind of like Sherlock Holmes of the area through the evidence that's left by the soils. And I've made rovers by repurposing remote control cars for children to create a surface accumulation rover, so that I don't have to do the backbreaking work of patting down the tape, but can use a remote control car to collect it. And this makes its way then into all of the exhibitions that I do, like this one that took place in Mumbai several years ago when I was teaching at Columbia University, where all of these drawings that I've shared with you are being are on presentation so that people can see the photography and the cartography together, animations on models to show how the monsoons enter and exit at a kind of large scale, but then also the films that I've developed to show how this happens much more at an on the ground from the perspective of a human within the area to better understand Ganga's descent. And then even in less than hospitable environments like this one in New Delhi at the American Center, where I did this exhibition where you can see these mannequins are actually wearing my instruments, the soiled socks, where here I'm giving a talk and walkthrough and a kind of performance of how I use these instruments to develop the maps and the drawings that I do. And then being on display, like you see here, along with all of the models of the tube wells and irrigation works in Seoul at the Seoul Architecture Biennial, where using old school overhead projectors with transparencies so that people could literally take transparencies and build up their own drawings to engage with how you might start to image this territory over time, as well as these sets of dioramas that show, for example, how the Ganga dip sock works, where here you can see somebody thrusting their foot into the silt to collect the soil, how I'd have to dry and the socks out on a kind of clothesline to do this work, to share with people the techniques that I use for this area. And so I worked then all the way from soil structures to urbanism, to regional scales, even to a larger celestial scale. I try to cut a cross-section through all of this to better image and understand the dynamism of this area. And I do that through the book, through op-eds that I've written for the New York Times and the Indian Express, as well as exhibitions and workshops. Because for me, it's very important to share this work with many different audiences. I think you can be brilliant in the work that you do, but if you don't have a way of sharing it, you're going to lead a very lonely revolution. So for me, it's very important to engage in different publics and different audiences to better share and understand rivers as river basins, as watersheds, the relationship between the monsoons, agriculture, infrastructure, and how they're constantly co-authoring this space. Because otherwise, I think we'll have the effects of sight without the benefits of insight in terms of the incredibly intelligent ways in which space is used in these areas and how we can build upon those deep rhythms of the monsoons as opposed to trying to kind of mute them. And with that, I'll end there. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was really quite terrific. Can I request everyone who's listening and all the participants to add your questions? I apologize if I didn't say that earlier on, but please add your questions to the Q&A and not to the chat. I don't know if the chat is even enabled for some of you, but to the Q&A, please. And we have also quite an incredible panel here of scholars, architects, all types. So really, we're going to open it up for a few questions, Anthony, if that's okay with you. So I just wanted to start with, just I wanted to say that it was really terrific to see the scalar thinking, the kind of movement from the cyborg hand all the way to various constructs that were much more sort of from the top. So I love this notion of the sinusoidal view of things. And I also absolutely love the idea of the katamari damacy, the Japanese sort of toy that collects things. And also the idea that you can somehow construct your own maps that you do at the Seoul Biennale. But one of the things that I was interested in, if you could talk to briefly, is how do you see, I mean, you alluded to it toward the end of your work, is how do you see the relevance or the agency of the project as it has grown? Because you did this, several years back, and now there's been somehow a history to your sort of advocacy, promotion of the project. And I was interested also in, you alluded to it again very fleetingly, to you said you've spoken to people in policy, So I would be interested in also understanding, you know, what are the implications of work like this in policy? So if you could talk about that briefly, and of course, we'd open it up to questions.
Certainly. Well, and thanks for those kind words. And what I would say is that on the policy side, I mean, there's different layers to it. So there's, of course, the non-government policy side of things in terms of addressing these issues, whether that's think tanks like CPR to the World Bank, to smaller NGOs. And then, of course, there's the government side. And then within that, as we know, there's the ministers that are appointed politically, the IAS officers, there's then the provincial government services, right? So there's all of these layers of policy. And I set all of that up to just say that it's an incredibly thick set of layers to go through. And in my experience, especially on the more political side and the IAS side, I'll be met with appreciation for the work that I've done, but oftentimes asked, okay, we need to think of this in a political cycle. So what can we do in the next 3 to 6 months to turn this around? Meaning the pollution, especially because under the BJP government, cleaning up Ganga has been such a major project, at least rhetorically, for the Prime Minister. So it's very hard to give a 3 to 6 month silver bullet for this. So the conversations that I have, especially more with IAS officers and political appointees, is very different than, say, the conversations I have with a think tank, or when I'm meeting with a panchayat, for example, at a much more local level about issues of groundwater, surface water, tube well irrigation, and drinking water facilities. So it really, talk about sinusoidal wave, one has to talk about these things in such different ways. So I find on the larger non-government, especially international side, there's a lot of talk about pollution, but on the ground, many people that I speak with care less about issues of pollution and more about how do I get water that I can drink, and care less about where the wastewater is going. But when you start to talk about how those two are interrelated, and how maybe if we pair drinking water and wastewater management and the periods of the monsoon to aquifer recharge, it gets people thinking and interested, and they become more interested in the issue of pollution. And so the work that I do doesn't come at pollution directly, but always has it kind of at the periphery, so it can sneak in. Because let's face it, from the Ganga Action Plan, right, in the 80s to the present, very little of note has been done. And so, but yet people keep running into it like a brick wall, that this is the way that you're going to address these issues. So that's I know that's not a made for TV answer to a very succinct question that you asked, but that's my best attempt at trying to speak about the layers of policy, people that are involved, and just trying to navigate it.
Can I request some of the panelists to turn on their videos if you can, only if you can, and very much welcome questions.
I found the talk absolutely fascinating. We all love maps, of course, and the revelation, of course, is also that, you know, what you spoke about, nature and culture erasing one another, or kind of, you know, almost battling it out in some ways, and the use of soft technology along the edges of nature and culture in some ways. The question is that your slide on the urinal, which was kind of a telling slide in that sense of wanting to kind of institute a hard technology at that edge versus soft technology. And I think these are all very intriguing questions that came up for me during the talk. And I was also wondering, what are your views on the hardening of such kind of treatments of the edge, particularly with with the canalization of rivers, with the riverfront developments, and so on?
Again, another great question, and I'll try to be more succinct. I mean, I think what we've seen that's taken place in Ahmedabad is really unfortunate in terms of the way that the Sabarmati right has been transformed basically into a giant pool. It's not even right. I mean, the amount of water that's having to be pumped in to develop that very kind of hard edge. And while I understand why it's been done in terms of especially real estate speculation, and of course the cement and concrete industry is extremely powerful in India and other parts of the world, I think that unfortunately it sets a very bad precedent for how to engage rivers and water bodies more generally, and the choreography of the monsoon. So I find that, I mean, even though I've shown you that Ganga kind of expands and contracts a lot, and it's really a river without banks, there's been an incredible amount of canalization that's happened with all of its irrigation works, especially with the Ganga canal system, and certainly even in the way that tube wells are affecting water flows and aquifers. But still, these rivers, if we understand them in that way, are monsoon fed. So the monsoon is always going to be dramatically transforming them. And I would say that the canalization process has had some devastating effects for sure across the basin. But something that's also extremely problematic is that what the tubewell allows for is not only to draw up groundwater, but allows for a kind of urbanization to take place that never happened before, because you couldn't permanently settle, right, with Pakka kind of architecture if you didn't have water year round. The tubewell allows that, and so it allows for a kind of diffuse urbanization to take place where you have many more houses, impermeable surfaces that all add up to water not getting into aquifers. So there's even more runoff that's happening, and there's less recharge. And because there's not a real commitment to building parks in a lot of these areas, you don't have a way of combining civic space and public space with groundwater recharge that is just extremely important in this area of the Gangetic Plains, and increasingly in other parts of South Asia and the Monsoonal belt in general. So for me, the canalization is an important part of the story, but equally is just the kind of effects of all of that diffuse bottom-up building of homes and buildings in general that really has denuded the landscape and are not allowed for the monsoons to recharge these areas. And that moves a lot more soil, a lot more debris as well. So all of that, I think if we don't have a way of drawing how all of those things come together, then it's a little bit like trying to plow the sea. Like, we're really operating in a space of being extremely blind. So that's why for me, doing these drawings of how that bottom up and top down, like where they meet, because I know, and you've probably had speakers come who are like, we need to get rid of the canals. Good luck with that. The political forces that operate there, not going to happen. I mean, for me, they are as natural as the Ganga. So good luck trying to get rid of the canal systems, especially upper reaches like in Hardwar and in Roorkee, right? I mean, those farmers and the Jats are extremely powerful. They're not going to let that happen. So I say good luck with that, but how do you start to understand where these things intersect and how they can work together? It's, to me, where there's a space for us as designers, because of how we can describe the world. So my drawings, I would say, are about describing the world, but also projecting one. And that's the unique thing that we have as designers that many other fields don't have. So it's not a perfect process, but I'm interested in how do you still allow for private property, houses, roads, canals to exist, and not see them as some kind of enemy. And I could talk more about that if you want, but again, I tried to be short and I gave you a long answer. Maaf kijiye, I'm sorry.
Yeah, wonderful talk. Fortunately, none of the earlier speakers asked us to remove the canals. So we haven't had that kind of an attitude. Two things struck me in your talk. One, I'm going to use literally. You talked about the flattening of space. And then you talked about the section rather than the plan. So if we are studying a city, in what way, if you were doing something in a city, in what way would you use the section and the information? What is the kind of information that might be exaggerated? Because if I look at all the three talks about water, they've all talked about section in some ways, about the disturbance or the furrowing of the landscape or the land line. And you talked about the braiding of the rivers. And I think there is something there which I would like to learn from. How would you go about studying a portion of a city in terms of section?
So that's a great question. And I mean, unfortunately, you have the benefit of you got to see the previous talks. I did not. But of course, I'm happy to hear that no one said, let's rip out the canals. Because I've certainly been in symposiums and at talks where people are like, why don't we do that? So it's nice to hear that that wasn't proposed. When it comes to the section, I mean, I think for me, so I think plans and sections, they're the same thing, right? So I think they're best done when they're done both at different times of the year. So how do you draw in time? I think is extremely important, both in the plan and in the section. And for me, especially from what little I know about the work that's being done in the studio on the Yamuna River, is the relationship between groundwater, surface water, and urbanization in these areas. Because I think that so often the way that we understand hand pumps and tube wells as though it's just drawing up water and it's in no way part of a larger commons. And I think that this kind of undercommons, quite literally, that exists, the more that we can draw it, but also show how do we draw it, not just in terms of kind of finger wagging, like you're taking too much water, it's unregulated, but how do we also then develop ideas around space of recharging that and sharing those resources that doesn't go back to trying to recreate step wells, nor a kind of atomized tube well system, but how do we draw all of those things together is where I think we as not just drawers and designers, but also how we can be more politically and socially active in terms of drawing people together to come around, I think, what would hopefully be a common purpose of potable water, aquifers, but also the shaping of space. So that's for me the power potentially of the section in doing that, and especially in terms of the Yamuna watershed, is to understand that surface water and groundwater as being so interconnected that you can't just separate the two, but they're part of a larger watershed. That was the shortest answer I've done so far, by the way, but I hope it was satisfying.
Thank you.
We have Professor Vasavda, Prem Chandavarkar, Riaz Tayabji. Questions. We can also open it up to some of the questions we've got in the chat here. Please, Prem.
You use a very evocative phrase, the deep rhythms of a monsoonal landscape. Now, people who are embedded in those rhythms, their relationship with those rhythms is quite sensory. The smell of the river, the sound of the river, the feel of the wind on your skin, things like that. And you must have experienced that in your study, and it's an incredible study, I must say. But when you extricate that into a book, the sensory dimension gets displaced. So I was wondering what you really felt was what got left behind when putting it into a book.
Well, thank you for that kind comment, and again for this great question. I mean, in doing the book, there's anthropologists, right, who are very much tied to staying in a community for a long period of time, writing a thick description and drawing in the sensory experience that people have with a river, with the monsoons. I certainly do some of that in the writing in the book, to speak about the way that people have written and certainly in my experiences described these rhythms. But for me, what was so important as an intervention, or what I decided to kind of double down on, was again this kind of how do all of these things come together, and of course things get left out. But I do think that one of the things I show in sharing with you these instruments is the subjectivity of measure. That measuring things is an extremely subjective undertaking. And I mean, I misuse socks, right? To collect soils. I use packaging tape. I think it opens up a conversation about how do we start to bring in different modes of sensing and making intelligible a landscape beyond just the purely cartographic. But certainly because, you know, I stayed with villagers in their mud huts with thatched roofs and cow dung floors. I slept on boats, on barges, right? And also in cars and lorries, etc., all over the place. There's certainly all kinds of conversations that I had with farmers, people living along the river, people living far away from it, that certainly shaped my understanding of it. But I felt that it was really important to how could I spatialize those dimensions as well. So I think it's for me, I look at the drawings and in the things that I write about in the book, and it's there, but it's certainly not as explicit in many of the passages and certainly in the writings. But unfortunately, so many things have to be edited. And the fact that I continue to work, I thought this work would take me a year and it took me a decade to do, I think says something about maybe my inability to edit things down, but I certainly had to make some hard choices about that, for sure.
I'm going to just synthesize a few questions here from the chat. There's like a lot of questions in the chat, so thank you all. But there's a few questions that talk not about removing canals, but definitely about breaking some of these concrete edges. So Sukhmani here says, hi Sukhmani says, what do you think of the work of Tourandscape headed by Dr. Hu in China on river edges where hard embankments have been broken to make softer and natural edges or embankments, and what is the possibility of doing that in India? Anna says, what about breaking the concrete at the Sabarmati riverfront? Great, we just put it in. And then, for example, the LA River has been, similar things have obviously happened also to the LA River. So yeah, some thoughts on, you know, what about the making of, the blurring of some of these edges? And then it in a way ties to the representation of this, where Kush says, how do you replace the two parallel lines usually used to describe or delineate rivers with several pochés overlaid one on top of the other? How did you manage to capture this movement and constant expansion and contraction without satellite imagery? So I think that the two relate.
Well, thank you for all of those questions. I would say that there's a wonderful system, right? Even in Allahabad, you have Bakshi Band, right, which was built during the time of Akbar, which is actually, it's to the to the north of the Sangam, that was built as an embankment to kind of slow down the water of the Ganga during the monsoons coming into the city of Allahabad near Akbar Kila. And you certainly have systems like that that exist all throughout the basin and across South Asia to deal with this, where it's built out of earth. Sometimes they get washed away. Certainly there's an entire system of that exists in the foothills of the Himalayas that's sadly been built out of concrete increasingly, but used to be built out of boulders. And also, even surprisingly, the National Inland Waterways has continued to use a system of bundling, which is where you use bamboo structures, you place them in the river to try to help shift the current in the riverbed so that it stays deep enough for boats or barges to pass through and shallow enough on the edges. And then of course the monsoons come and they wash it all away. So I think no matter what, the more channeling that happens of the river, the more breaks and the more violent those breaks will be. So I think it makes a lot of sense in India to not keep building these things, but to think of them as being much more permeable. Never mind that the water level changes dramatically when you build all of these hard embankments that, along with all of the tube wells, creates a lot of sinking of buildings from Delhi to Allahabad, elsewhere too. With respect then to how did I draw rivers not as parallel lines, and this is connected then certainly to this question about not building hard embankments. I used my instruments to be able to collect those soil samples, and I could tell where the river was at in terms of the riverbed, the water levels based upon the soil being dispersed. So that's how I was able to draw how it expands and contracts. And it allows me to be like a detective in that way. And I'm able to just take that strip, and by doing so many of those strips, I'm able to do the section and the plan and to better understand that choreography, but also how people inhabit those areas as well. So I want to see how they're all entangled, as opposed to just doing like what a hydrographer would do with taking the particle sizes to form a formula to calculate sediment loads. So I'm misusing them, and that's how I'm able to do those kinds of drawings. I also use photography because, as you all were taught in architecture and have been taught in architecture school or design school, you can draw a perspective from a plan view. Well, you can do the reverse. So I would use photographs to then construct the plan view, but also to do the section. So that allowed me to do this in a way that like a typical land surveyor wouldn't. And because a meter of difference in elevation can make a huge change in terms of a watershed in a place like the Gangetic Plains. So it allowed me to also, in my drawings, be very observant of those changes. And then fortunately the railway lines too, because rail can't go up a very steep hill, also became a kind of datum that I could use as well to do elevation, because back when I was doing this work in 2005, GPSs were and still are not very good at elevation, right, vertically. So that's how I kind of triangulated through these different tools that I had at my disposal and that I made to make those kinds of drawings of how water bodies, and it's not just that I'm drawing the river, right? I personally think it's very useful to use the term river and to expand it. So that's why I always draw all of the surface water bodies as well. So all of those tanks, tals, kunds, all of those are drawn, and how they expand and contract as well in with the rhythms of the riverbed, to understand how they're all actually connected with the nalas, etc. So again, watershed, Shiv's hair, as opposed to parallel lines. I don't know though, Sarosh, if that answered all of those questions.
Thank you. I think Riaz has a question.
Anthony, I just wanted to say what an amazing, amazing talk this was, and really I was taken by the sheer sense of the effort that must have gone into this. I mean, was this completely a single-handed documentation, or at some point did you have teams and researchers working with you as well? Because I mean, everything from the technique, the method, I mean, I see certain relationships between the jugaad of your glove to the way that technology in that area is looked at and dealt with. So all of that, I was just wondering, was there a way that you scaled the enterprise while you were finding out? Because the scope of data that you were able to collect, it seems, is just incredible. So I mean, just a little bit more on the process that you engaged, apart from the fact that you walked it yourself and picked up stuff and all of that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that that question. I mean, I had friends, especially like at Allahabad University, who would travel with me by boat because they wanted to see parts of Ganga. But no, most of the work I did, it was flying solo. I mean, I am so thankful that there were no maps, and I'm so thankful that I didn't have good satellite imagery, and I'm extremely thankful I didn't have drones, because I really had to go out, chat with people, right? Learn Hindustani, right? Do the work that, of this project, and I'm not showing you all of the mistakes that I made in terms of the instruments that I made. Like originally, the surface accumulation sleeve, I was using cotton, rolls of cotton to try to pick up soils, but they get extremely heavy, and it was hard to do the reading. So I instead used packaging tape, because packaging tape works really well when things are dry, and it's such a thin surface. So there were like just little things like that. But I was just deeply inspired by the fact, and humbled, that I had this kind of crazy idea that I could do all of this work in a year to try to image this incredibly dynamic landscape. And I think because like being in a place like UP, where I didn't have electricity for more than 4 and 5 hours at a time, right, because of all the power sheds that would happen, I had nothing to do but go and do my work. So I mean, and believe me, I miss the adventures that I got to have every day. No 2 days of my life doing this work were ever the same. I mean, my life in New York pre-pandemic was nothing compared to what I, right, the joy and the excitement that I got to have in doing this work in the Gangetic Plains. So I just really developed a romance for the river basin, to put it very crudely. So yeah.
No, I wanted to lead to the question also, because I wanted to understand how you considered scale when you were doing these maps, and the kind of decisions you would have to take, at which scale you would represent. And you know, I imagine that when you are talking about something that shifts and something that changes, the scale at which one actually looks and therefore holds it for a moment in the drawing is imperative, because the pattern changes when you change scale. So I was just wondering how you decided, you know, and one way of looking at it was, if you have a larger team, then you're able to look at things simultaneously. I mean, I imagine then you can spread out. But like you said, some of your techniques had to take into account the fact that, let's say the sock method, which I thought was fantastic, you know, that you can look at the soil at different places, and in that sense collapse time. But I was really curious about how you thought about a scale when you were looking at the process of representation.
So again, great question, and sorry I didn't answer this about the scale. So before, I mean, I think the transect really allows me to dig into scales, because I'm not literally trying to draw the entire river basin. It's a little bit like in demography, a sample survey. So it's like doing polling essentially, right? For elections, I'm kind of doing that here. So I would focus on these transects. I would keep going back to them and keep photographing them. And they're also, I'm able to shift scale. So there was that transect I showed that was even like a zoomed in of one of the transects where I'm looking very closely at cropping patterns, all of the hand pumps and tube wells that exist along with the surface water irrigation systems. So I was able to zoom in on certain places to better understand them and the choreography and the conflicts, but also the confluences that happen there in terms of resources. And also the soil structures were able to give me a sense of scale too. So I was able to move through that. So I would say between all of those and then the GPS gives me this kind of global positioning as well. So again, I just would triangulate through those, and you're right, like what scale you draw at, as well as like how you engage time, brings very different things to the foreground and other things go to the background. So I tried to use the transects to then, what could I kind of foreground and background to look at things differently, because I just wanted to constantly not look at the same space in the same way twice, essentially. So yeah, the transects allow me to kind of zoom in and out, but also make larger claims about the larger basin as well.
So it's not, sorry, it's not really a zooming in and a zooming out spatially, but more about looking at moments in time in the shifts that are taking place in the landscape. Am I understanding? When you look at, let's say, the settlements which are moving and adjusting vis-a-vis the transects, would that be a fair assessment of how one should read the representation?
Yes, and how I'm trying to plot out the extremes so that there's, again, that kind of seam allowance or ready to wear adjustability that happens with the extremes. And then, you know, a typical cartographer is like very obsessed with like just precisely geolocating. But in a context that's moving so fast, those kinds of drawings are obsolete before they're even done. So I think this is one of the reasons why the Survey of India has not done mapping of this area in such a long time. And I don't blame them, because the techniques that they've inherited, even satellite imagery and using that, I just don't think you can get the same kind of perspective that you can when you're on the ground doing the work, and then when you're drawing in plan. I mean, and I've incorporated satellite imagery over time into the work that I do, but I've come to not rely on it as much as I think some of our colleagues do who do all of these GIS sets and think that that's the truth.
So maybe we have time for one more question, if that's okay, Anthony. I know it's going to be close to 2 hours. So if we don't put a stop to this, this won't end. So I'm going to propose one more, if that's okay with you.
That's totally fine, Sarosh, but just so we're also fair, I think in the poster announcement that I got for all of the speakers, mine was the only lecture that gave a start time and not an end time.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I don't know if you want to stick to that. That might be a difficult thing. Okay, so I'm going to try and combine a few questions that that kind of revolve around silt, and myself included. I had some thoughts on this. So what happens to all that silt that is deposited every year is kind of an obvious question. I think you spoke a little bit about it being used in the black market and so on, but more thoughts on that. And then when drawing the surface of the river and by seeing the importance of silt throughout the talk, wouldn't it be important to also draw or represent where the silt remains? And I was sort of interested also, based on the last conversation, on sort of what I found really compelling was that the transept allows you to look at the same scale across different sort of temporal conditions, but also I think that there is also certainly a scalar capacity to the work, but in almost every scale, you start seeing the entanglements between that which is sort of quote natural and that which is completely and totally a kind of construct of the Anthropocene. Or would you say that all of it is, we can no longer even operate with thinking of the river as the whole thing is a kind of large techno-engineered enterprise, where silt then becomes almost a kind of currency that flows across this machine and can be read at different scales in different ways. And one of the things that that I cannot sort of wrap around my head is I read somewhere, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I read somewhere that it takes almost 100 years or more to generate 1 centimeter of silt. So if you're generating mountains of silt in a matter of days, I wonder if that is being all that is just soil being washed off from the top hills of the Himalayas. Like, what are the kind of entanglements between human and natural constructs of silt across time and scale? I guess that's the kind of meta question.
So yeah, great questions. I mean, what I would say, one of the reasons that I talk about and go with this term water machine is that I think this idea between nature and culture is a false divide. It's been one that's been undone many times by environmental historians and others. And in fact, I mean, many of us wear shoes, right? We have glasses. If you've had a cavity and you've gotten a filling, I mean, we are cyborgs. So that kind of difference between nature and culture, besides its roots in a kind of pre-lapsarian kind of Judeo-Christian model, right, is, I understand why certain people align with it, but for me, that's the really intriguing part about working in a place like the Gangetic Plains, is that in the same way that I think what's city and what's not is up for grabs, because 60% of UP is said to be rural. I think also what constitutes the river basin, and for me, I understand the Ganges Canal to be just as much a part of the Ganga as the supposed waters flowing from Gangotri Glacier. With respect to then the silt, the thing is that it takes a very long time for that silt to travel, because of course it kind of keeps getting clogged up at different moments, especially with all of the dams in terms of the riverbed itself. But then again, all of those nalas, so the time that it takes to move is pretty extraordinary, as well as the amount of time to produce it. In places like Varanasi, I mean, the moment that the water starts to go down and all of that silt is there, people come out with power hoses and diesel-powered engines to push it all away, then comes back up and they do it again, right? So at all the Ghats, so that happens. But it's also because of that incredibly nutritious silt that comes that makes it such an incredibly lush place for agriculture. So in the drawings that I do, I would say that I'm indexing in those tones of violet the behaviors of not just water, but of silt as well. And so the islands and the shoals that form, I draw, and how they move and shape over time. And certainly at Allahabad, at the Sangam, you know, every year Magh Mela happens, and every year the sandbars are different. And so, you know, the UP government, along with the Pragwels, right, the Brahmins who oversee this area, come together and they lay out everything, and there's all this hemming and hawing about how to lay it out, and bulldozers come and they're pushing soil around, but they have to adjust to, I mean, no 2 years are the same. And so that co-authoring to me is something that's just, it's incredibly powerful, I think, as a way of understanding the dynamism of this place, and that you can't, like, trying to keep track of where all of the silt comes from is incredibly difficult and maybe an impossible task. But also then when you start to, when the way I use my instruments, then I'm able to see how car parts move, plastic bottles. You know, I'll get hair follicles, right? If somebody has just cut their, I mean, there's lots of narratives that I can tell about this area through the soil and the silt. And I mean, I tried to show it again as loosely, but still precisely as possible to give a sense of that dynamism. I mean, but the silt in the riverbed itself has been dramatically affected by the canals and all of the dams that have been built and barrages. But on the other hand, there's an incredible amount of silt and dirt that's been placed there over millions of years that come through the nalas because of just the amount of backing up that happens during the amount of water that's shed from the monsoons that go into it. So it's kind of, the short answer is it's coming from all directions, basically.
Thank you again, Anthony. And really, this was beautiful, wonderful to do this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And thank you to all our panelists and to all our listeners from all over the world. Thank you very much.
And thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to share all this work with all of you and your incredibly kind questions and feedback.
Thank you.